I thought opening up our marriage would bring us closer. Instead, he found love and I lost everything. This is how I went from a confident wife to single mom living with my mother. I'm Tiffany, and honestly, this whole mess started because I was trying to save my marriage. Yeah, you heard that right. While everyone's acting like I'm some monster, I was actually trying to fix things with Thomas. Look, we'd been together for 7 years, married for 4, and things were getting stale, like really stale. We have twin boys who are 6 now, and between work and kids and just life, we were basically roommates who happened to share a bed. Thomas works in logistics or supply chain something. I handle financial stuff for a company downtown. We were both just going through the motions. I started noticing things online, Women talking about how they opened up their relationships and suddenly felt alive again, how they stopped feeling trapped and started feeling like themselves. And honestly, it made sense to me. Why should we be limited to just one person for the rest of our lives? That's not realistic in today's world. Thomas, though, God, he was so traditional about everything. Every time I'd bring up anything even slightly outside the norm, he'd get this look on his face like I was speaking another language. I'd mention how some couple we knew seemed happy doing their own thing, and he'd just change the subject. It was frustrating because I felt like I was growing as a person, and he was just stuck. I wasn't asking for anything crazy at first. I was just trying to have conversations about what modern relationships could look like. But every time I brought it up, he'd get all uncomfortable and defensive. Like, sorry for trying to improve our situation. Sorry for not wanting to just accept that this is as good as it gets. The thing is, I'd already been connecting with this guy from work. Nothing physical, obviously, but we had these amazing conversations about books and movies and life philosophy. Stuff Thomas never wanted to talk about. This guy actually listened to my ideas and didn't make me feel like I was asking for too much. And yeah, maybe I was staying late at work more often than necessary, but it's not like anything inappropriate was happening. I started doing research because I'm not the type to just jump into something without understanding it. I read articles about successful open marriages, watched videos about polyamory, joined online groups where people shared their experiences. And you know what? Most of the success stories involved couples who communicated openly and approached it as a team. That's what I wanted for us. But Thomas couldn't see past his own insecurities. Every time I tried to share what I was learning, he'd get this martyred expression, like I was torturing him. I'd send him articles about how opening up your relationship can actually strengthen your bond, and he'd barely skim them before dismissing the whole thing. It was like he didn't even want to try to understand where I was coming from. The more I learned about alternative relationship styles, the more I realized how limiting our current situation was. We were both young, we had our whole lives ahead of us, and we were just settling for this boring routine. I'd see other couples who seemed so much more alive and connected, and I'd think about how we could have that too if Thomas would just be open to new experiences. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, I was trying to save us. I could see where we were heading. The same conversations, the same routines, the same gradual drift apart that happens to so many couples. At least this way, we'd be making an active choice to stay together while also getting our needs met elsewhere. That seemed so much healthier than just slowly resenting each other. But explaining this to Thomas was like talking to a wall. He kept acting like I was asking him to do something terrible instead of something that could help both of us. And honestly, his reaction made me question whether he was really the right person for me long term. Like, if he couldn't even consider the possibility that our relationship could evolve, what did that say about our future together? I started feeling like I was wasting my best years on someone who didn't want to grow with me. And that's when I decided I had to push harder for what I knew could work for us, even if it meant having some difficult conversations first. So, I got strategic about it. Someone had to be the adult in this situation, right? I started pointing out all the ways our relationship had gotten predictable, like when we'd have the same conversation about his day at work, or when we'd watch TV in separate rooms, or when we'd go weeks barely touching each other. I'd ask him if this was really what he wanted for the rest of his life. And you know what his response was? He wanted to try date nights. Date nights? Like we were some couple in the suburbs who just needed to remember to go to Olive Garden once a month. I tried to explain that surface-level fixes weren't going to address the deeper issues, but he couldn't see past his simple solutions. I started sharing articles with him, casually at first. I'd leave them up on my laptop when he walked by, or mention something I'd read about how successful couples navigate relationship challenges. When he seemed interested, I'd dig deeper. I found these amazing pieces about how monogamy is actually a fairly recent concept historically, and how some of the happiest couples are those who've moved beyond traditional limitations. But every time I tried to have a real conversation about it, he'd deflect. He'd suggest we take a vacation instead, or talk about maybe getting a babysitter more often so we could go out. It was like he was willfully missing the point. I wasn't talking about logistics. I was talking about fundamental relationship structure. I started bringing up examples from our friends, like how Sarah seemed so much happier after she and her husband started exploring outside connections, or how Mark was always talking about how fulfilled he felt since he and his partner opened things up, but Thomas would just make these uncomfortable faces and change the subject. The more resistance I got from him, the more I realized this was about his own insecurities. He was threatened by the idea that I might connect with someone else because he didn't have confidence in what we had together. A secure person would be able to handle their partner having other experiences. A strong relationship would survive and even benefit from outside connections. I tried approaching it from different angles. I'd talk about how much stress we were both under, how we'd both benefit from having additional emotional support. I'd mention how isolating it felt to expect one person to meet all your needs. I'd point out how much pressure that puts on a relationship, especially when you add kids and work and all the other demands of adult life. When he'd get that look like I was asking for something unreasonable, I'd remind him of times when he'd been distant or unavailable, like when he was working those crazy hours last year and barely talked to me for weeks, or when he was dealing with his dad's health issues and was completely emotionally checked out. Wouldn't it have been better for both of us if I'd had other sources of connection during those times? I even suggested we could start small, maybe just flirting with other people or having deep friendships that included some emotional intimacy. Nothing physical at first, just expanding our horizons gradually. But he acted like I was suggesting we burn the house down. The whole thing became this pattern where I'd try to have a mature conversation about our relationship's future and he'd shut down or try to distract me with these band-aid solutions. It was exhausting being the only one willing to do the emotional work of figuring out how to improve things. Finally, I had to be more direct. I told him I'd been doing a lot of thinking about what I needed to feel fulfilled and that our current setup wasn't meeting those needs. I explained that I loved him and wanted to stay married, but that I also needed the freedom to explore other connections. I made it clear that this wasn't about him not being enough. It was about me needing variety and growth. And you know what? After weeks of resistance, he finally agreed to try it for 6 months. I think he realized I was serious about this being important to me and that fighting it wasn't going to make it go away. Plus, I made sure he understood that this could benefit him too once he got over his initial discomfort. Oh my God, it was like a whole new world opened up for me. Within the first week, I'd connected with 3 different guys through various apps and work connections. And let me tell you, the attention was incredible. After years of feeling invisible in my own marriage, suddenly I had men who were genuinely interested in getting to know me, who wanted to hear my thoughts, who made me feel desirable again. There was this one guy from accounting who I'd been chatting with for months. Remember the work friend I mentioned? Well, now that things were officially open, we could actually explore what we'd been building. And it was amazing. He was so different from Thomas. More intellectual, more emotionally available, actually interested in having deep conversations about life and philosophy. Then there was this guy I met through a dating app who was into fitness and adventure sports. Complete opposite of Thomas, who thinks hiking counts as extreme exercise. This guy wanted to take me rock climbing and kayaking and all these exciting things I'd never done. It was like rediscovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. And the third guy was this artist type who saw shows and knew about wine and could actually hold a conversation about culture. Do you know how long it had been since someone wanted to discuss books with me? Or music that wasn't just whatever was on the radio. It was so refreshing to feel intellectually stimulated again. Meanwhile, Thomas was, well, let's just say he wasn't exactly embracing the opportunity. He'd half-heartedly swipe through dating apps for like 10 minutes and then complain that it felt weird. Like, of course it feels weird at first. Everything new feels weird until you get used to it. But instead of pushing through that initial discomfort, he'd just give up. I tried to be encouraging. I'd ask about his dates, offer to help him with his profile, suggest ways he could meet people who shared his interests. But he was so negative about the whole thing. He'd go on one awkward coffee date and then act like the entire concept was flawed instead of just accepting that dating takes practice. Honestly, watching him struggle made me realize how much I'd been holding myself back to accommodate his limited comfort zone. Here I was, thriving and growing and experiencing all these new connections while he was stuck in the same patterns that had been making both of us miserable. I started staying out later because, when you're building new relationships, you need time to nurture them. But every time I'd come home from a date, Thomas would be waiting up with this pathetic expression like I'd done something wrong. I'd try to share how my evening went, thinking he'd be happy that I was happy. But instead, he'd get all moody and distant. The rules we'd agreed on were pretty reasonable, I thought. I could go out on weeknights as long as I was home before midnight. Weekends were more flexible and we'd both be home for family dinners and important kid stuff. But he started acting like every time I exercised my freedom, I was somehow violating our agreement. He'd make these passive-aggressive comments about how I seemed more excited about my dates than about spending time with our family, which wasn't even true. I was just finally feeling like myself again, which made me better at everything, including being a mom. But he couldn't see that because he was too focused on feeling sorry for himself. The money thing became an issue too. Like, obviously, when you're dating multiple people, there are expenses involved. New clothes, dinners out, entertainment, gas money for driving to different places. I wasn't being irresponsible about it, but he started questioning every purchase like I was some teenager asking for allowance money. I reminded him that he was welcome to spend money on his own dating experiences, but since he barely went on any dates, that argument didn't get much traction. It felt unfair that I should have to limit my experiences just because he wasn't taking advantage of his own opportunities. The most frustrating part was how he'd want to process everything constantly. Like every time I came home, he'd want to know how I was feeling about us, and whether I thought this was working, and if I still loved him. It was exhausting having to constantly manage his insecurities when I was trying to focus on my own growth and exploration. I started feeling like I was living with a roommate who happened to be really needy and jealous. We'd agreed to this arrangement, but he was making it so difficult to actually enjoy it. Instead of celebrating that his wife was happy and fulfilled, he was making everything about his own discomfort. Then everything changed, and not in a good way. Thomas met someone at some work conference thing and suddenly he was acting completely different. At first, I was actually relieved. Finally, he was going to experience what I'd been talking about all along. Maybe once he had his own connection, he'd understand why this was so important to me. But no, instead of just enjoying himself like a normal person, he had to go and get all serious about it. Her name's Rosalie, and from the way he talked about her, you'd think she was some kind of angel sent from heaven. It wasn't like my connections, which were fun and exciting, but appropriately casual. He was acting like he'd found his soulmate or something. And the changes in him were honestly annoying. Suddenly, he was more confident, less clingy, less interested in my day-to-day activities, which should have been good, right? But instead of appreciating the space I'd been asking for, I found myself missing the attention he used to give me. It's like he'd flipped some switch and decided he didn't need my approval anymore. He started talking about Rosalie constantly, how smart she was, how funny, how easy she was to talk to. Meanwhile, I'm juggling 3 different relationships and somehow managing to keep our household running, and he's obsessing over one person like some lovesick teenager. It was honestly embarrassing. The worst part was how he started comparing everything to her. Like, I'd mention wanting to try a new restaurant, and he'd say, "Oh, Rosalie took me to this amazing place last week." Or I'd talk about a movie I wanted to see, and he'd go, "Rosalie has such interesting perspectives on film." It was like he couldn't have a conversation without bringing her up. And then he started pushing boundaries that we'd clearly established. He wanted to bring her to family events, introduce her to the kids, take weekend trips together. I had to remind him that our agreement was about exploration and personal growth, not about building serious outside relationships that could threaten our family stability. When I tried to explain why some of his requests weren't appropriate, he got defensive and accused me of changing the rules. But that's not what was happening. I was just trying to protect what we'd built together. My connections were fun additions to my life, but they weren't replacing him as my primary partner. His thing with Rosalie felt different and not in a good way. I started suggesting that maybe he was getting too emotionally involved too quickly. Like, it's one thing to enjoy someone's company, but it's another thing to start planning your life around them. I tried to point out that this was supposed to be about enhancing our marriage, not creating competition for it. But he couldn't see how his obsession with her was affecting our family dynamic. The kids started asking why Daddy was always texting someone, why he seemed happier when he was leaving than when he was coming home. I was the one who had to manage their confusion while he was off in his little fantasy world. The thing that really got to me was how different he was with her versus with me. I'd watch him get ready for their dates with this excitement he hadn't shown for anything in years. Meanwhile, when we spent time together, he was distracted and distant, like he was just going through the motions until he could get back to his real life. It became obvious that while I was handling multiple relationships maturely and keeping everything in perspective, he was completely losing himself in this one connection. I started to worry that he was making decisions based on new relationship energy instead of thinking about what was best for our family long term. I tried talking to him about it, but he'd get this defensive attitude like I was being jealous or controlling, which was ridiculous. I was the one who'd opened our marriage in the first place. I obviously wasn't threatened by him having other connections. I was just concerned about how seriously he was taking something that was supposed to be casual and fun. So I had to take action to protect our family. I started implementing some additional guidelines that should have been obvious from the beginning. No overnight stays, no meeting our children, no vacation trips together. Basic boundaries that any responsible parent would insist on when there are kids involved. But Thomas lost his mind over these completely reasonable requests. He started arguing that I was being hypocritical since I'd been staying out late and going on weekend trips with my connections. But that was totally different. My relationships weren't threatening our family structure because I kept them in their proper place. His thing with Rosalie was clearly becoming something that could destabilize everything we'd built. When I tried to explain the difference, he got all hostile and accused me of trying to control his relationships while doing whatever I wanted with mine. But he was missing the point entirely. I was trying to save our marriage from his poor judgment. Someone had to be the adult and think about the bigger picture. I started paying closer attention to his phone activity because his behavior was becoming so concerning. And honestly, what I found was worse than I expected. They were texting constantly throughout the day, sharing these inside jokes and intimate conversations that should have been happening between us. He was basically having an emotional affair, disguised as an open relationship. When I confronted him about the inappropriate level of contact, he had the nerve to question my own phone habits, which was completely different. Yes, I communicated with my connections, but I wasn't replacing him as my primary emotional support system. I knew how to maintain appropriate boundaries. The situation with the kids was getting worse too. They were asking questions about why Daddy had a special friend and why Mommy seemed upset all the time. I was doing my best to shield them from the adult drama, but Thomas's selfishness was making that impossible. He was so wrapped up in his own happiness that he couldn't see how his choices were affecting our children. I tried suggesting that maybe we should take a break from the open marriage experiment since it wasn't working the way we'd planned. I thought a temporary pause would help him get some perspective and remember what was actually important. But instead of being grateful for the chance to refocus on our family, he completely flipped out. He said he wanted to end the open marriage, but also wanted to end our marriage entirely. Like, what? The whole point of opening things up was to strengthen our relationship, not destroy it. But apparently his few months with Rosalie had convinced him that what we had wasn't worth saving. I reminded him of everything we'd built together. Our home, our children, our shared history. I pointed out that he was throwing away 7 years for someone he'd known for a few months. But he was so caught up in his fantasy that he couldn't think rationally about the consequences of his decisions. He started talking about lawyers and custody arrangements, like our marriage was just some business transaction he could walk away from. I tried to explain that this was exactly why I'd been worried about his relationship with Rosalie. He was letting her influence him to make decisions that would hurt our entire family. But every conversation just made things worse. He'd gotten this cold, detached attitude where he acted like I was being unreasonable for wanting to save our marriage. Like somehow I was the problem for not wanting to give up on everything we'd worked for. The most infuriating part was how he kept acting like this was all my fault because I'd suggested the open marriage in the first place. But that completely ignored the fact that he was the one who'd violated the spirit of our agreement by getting emotionally involved with someone else. I'd never signed up for him to replace me as his primary partner. So here's where I am now, 2 years later, and honestly, everyone can go to hell. I'm living with my mom because the divorce settlement was complete garbage. Thomas's lawyer somehow convinced the judge that my affair partners, which is ridiculous because we had an open marriage, proved I wasn't committed to our relationship. And apparently, all the money I spent on my personal growth during that time counted against me too. The alimony is barely enough to cover basic expenses, and I lost the house we bought together. Meanwhile, Thomas gets to play happy family with Rosalie in some new place they bought together. She probably thinks she won some prize, but honestly, she has no idea what she's gotten herself into. Give it a few years and she'll see who he really is. My mom won't stop with the "I told you so" lectures. Every day it's something about how I threw away a good man and destroyed my family. Like she has any idea what my marriage was actually like. She didn't have to live with someone who couldn't grow or change or see beyond his own limited perspective. And the dating scene? Complete disaster. Turns out men are way less interested in divorced moms than they are in married women looking for excitement. Who knew? All those guys who were so eager to spend time with me before have mysteriously disappeared now that I'm actually available. It's like they only wanted what they couldn't have. Work has been a nightmare too. My performance reviews have been terrible because apparently going through a divorce affects your ability to focus on spreadsheets and client meetings. I got passed over for a promotion I definitely deserved. And now I'm stuck in the same position while watching less qualified people advance around me. But you know what the worst part is? Watching Thomas transform into this confident, successful version of himself that he never was with me. He got some big promotion at work, bought a nice house, seems genuinely happy all the time. And everyone acts like this is some great thing instead of recognizing that he's basically stolen the life we were supposed to build together. The kids prefer staying at his place, which honestly hurts more than I expected. They come back from his house talking about all the fun activities Rosalie plans and how organized everything is there. Like, sorry, I can't compete with someone who doesn't have the stress of rebuilding her entire life from scratch. I see them sometimes around town, Thomas and Rosalie and my kids looking like some perfect little family. They go to the farmer's market and school events and act like they've been together forever. It's disgusting how quickly she inserted herself into the life I built. My friends have mostly chosen sides, and guess whose side they chose? Apparently, everyone thinks Thomas was this long-suffering saint who finally found happiness. They've all forgotten how unhappy our marriage was and how hard I tried to fix things before it got to this point. I'm 31 now, living in my childhood bedroom, working a dead-end job, and watching my ex-husband live my best life with someone else. And everyone acts like this is somehow what I deserve instead of recognizing that I'm the victim of circumstances beyond my control. Sometimes I wonder if I should try to fight for him back. But honestly, why would I want someone who could throw away our entire history so easily? If he was the kind of person who could move on that quickly, then maybe I'm better off without him. At least now I know who he really is. But mostly, I just think about how unfair the whole thing is. I was trying to improve our situation, and somehow I'm the one who ended up with nothing while he got everything he never deserved. In the end, he moved on and I was left behind. Maybe I asked for too much. Or maybe I just never saw the man he was becoming.